Hello, folks. I told y'all the other week I had a story about two mules. Now, these are not the mules that the story's about. As far as I know, there's no photographic evidence of the two mules. And just being honest with you, I don't even know where that picture come from. That's not level, is it? You know, I never realized I was so tall until I started to try to figure out how to get myself in the frames when making YouTube videos. Crazy, ain't it? But anyway, the two mules, mule were famous mules in my family's history. It's gonna be a kind of cute little story, so hang around. You might find it interesting. You certainly might. I got to sit down. I'm down here in the bunker, down here in the pipe lounge where we do a lot of our stuff, harvest honey, things like that. But the way I received this story was from my granddaddy and my dad. I'm sorry, I'm putting a prop up. I'll be right back. Growing up here, they had to farm to eke out a survival. I've told people many times the things I do as a hobby, you know, with chickens, goats, honeybees, whatever. My family, and not that far back, my granddaddy worked like a dog in the fields to put food on the table to survive. They never thrived, but they survived. But there are two mules that was always spoke of, Tom and Dan. My granddaddy owned Dan, and my great uncle Odell owned Tom. They were used here on the farm. I don't know if they were ever used in a pair, or if they were just used singular here and there. But I still have the plows that Dan pulled. That would have been a good prop to have. But anyway, I'm just that type of person. I'm very sentimental about stuff like that. But the story started, as far back as I can remember, my granddaddy always mentioning Dan. And Dan was a mule of mules, according to my granddaddy. He bragged about how that when they were out plowing, that when they get to the end of the row, that, you know, Dan would turn and my granddaddy would get the plow set back up, and my granddaddy would be winded. And he said, so we'd stand there just for a few moments to catch our breath. And he said, but as soon as old Dan took one big deep breath and let it back out, he said, I knew Dan was ready to go. So here we go. And I remember my daddy talking about riding on the back of Dan when he was a child while my granddaddy plowed. I'm sure it's the way Pawpaw was babysitting. And yes, that's what I called my granddaddy, Pawpaw. And Dad told me he remembered getting hold of the reins, you know, trying to steer Dan. And of course, now mules back in those days didn't necessarily need that rein action. I remember my granddaddy talking about Dan getting too close to the row of corn or cotton, whatever it was. And he said, get off that row, Dan. And he said that mule would just move right over and get off the row. Of course, there was G and Ha. I think G was right, Ha was left. And of course, we all know what wool means. But Dad said he would ride on the back of Dan while my granddaddy was plowing the field. Dad said he could remember seeing the mule white with sweat, salt. And he said my granddaddy, up under his shirts and his overalls, would be white as well. We're working out in the field. Boy, we got it made now. We get on a tractor and just pull the plows. Back then, they had to walk behind them. But Dan was a mule that my granddaddy spoke of many times. And my granddaddy was not what you'd call an emotional type person, but he had some great memories of Dan. And I can remember the first time I ever saw my grandfather break down and shed a tear was when he was talking about my Uncle Lane, who was stillborn, and he had to go and build a box to bury that little baby in. And that's the first time I ever saw my granddaddy shed a tear ever. And but he would talk about Dan, and it would bring back good points in his life. Dad said that him and Uncle Jack would ride Dan, and then Odell, who owned Tom, cousin Paul was his only son, and they would have mock battles with Paul on Tom and Dad and Jack on Dan. And so when my granddaddy finally got a job hauling chicken feed, I think he was working for Aubrey Shadwick, but he finally got rid of Dan. He sold him, I think. That is one cloudy thing. I can't remember what ever become of Dan. He did not die here on the farm. But now Tom, he lived out his life on the farm. Now my great-grandmother lived till 59 or 60. Maybe she died in 60. And so she just lived, 75 yards from my grandparents. So Papa went out there one day to check on things, and she told him, she said, Odell's found Tom dead down there in the pasture. Said, won't you go down there and see if he needs some help? So Papa went down there, and he had died down on the other side of my property, down there close to the branch. I know y'all seen these houses around my house in videos. That used to be our property as well, but he died on that property. And so when Papa got down there, Odell was gathering up logs, limbs, and brush, and piling it up on Tom. And so Papa said, what you doing? He said, well, I'm gonna burn him. He said, neither one of us, at that time, I think Odell was already having some heart issues, and all the other brothers were gone doing their own things. So they didn't have the manpower. And so Papa said, no, we can't burn him. He was too good of a mule. And so they drug him down into the branch bank, the branch gully, ravine, and was able to dig back into the bank far enough. They was able to give him a somewhat proper burial. So that was the respect and that my granddaddy had for Tom. And he wasn't granddaddy's mule, but he was Dan's brother. Tom and Dan were brothers. Don't know how far apart, stuff like that, but they're brothers. If I've already mentioned that, I'm sorry. 2 for price 1. But even when Papa's mind started slipping, he would talk about Dan. Even when he finally ended up in a nursing home, he'd still talk about plowing with Dan. Dan, get off that row. Gee, ha. Using Dan to cover up the fertilizer. You'd have to get a turning plow and turn that dirt over against the row of whatever to cover up the fertilizer, which was called guaner. Have you ever heard fertilizer called guaner? Well, that's what it was back in the day. And it come in 200-pound sacks. And my granddaddy could carry 2 of those things. Put one on this shoulder, one on that shoulder, and start walking. Daddy told me he saw it happen many times. 400 pounds walking across plowed field. Now, if you want to just visualize your mind walking from the beach to your condo, carrying all kinds of crap in sand. That's the only way I can even picture in my mind what it must have been like for my granddaddy carrying 400 pounds of guaner fertilizer across the field. So, but needless to say, Dan passed somewhere. We don't know where. Like I said, I'm not clear on what exactly happened to Dan. I just know he didn't die here. But my granddad, like I said, who didn't seem to be a very sentimental type person, kept something for years. And now I have it. This was Dan's collar. He would hook up to this, and I don't know how all of it worked, but the leaders and these other stuff that worked in here. But this was Dan's collar, and it hung in the barn from my youth as far back as I can remember. And after my granddaddy passed, my grandmother rented out the pasture for horses. And some jackleg decided they wanted to hang their horse tack where Dan's collar was hanging, and they laid it down. Well, and then the rats got into it. This appears to be, it could be broom straw. I don't know what it is, but it's the packing in it. It makes me mad that happened, but it did. But Daddy, when Daddy saw this, he got it up, hung it back on the wall in the barn. And when I got this property from my grandmother, this went into my basement. Dan's collar. Can you believe my granddaddy, that crusty old man who could cuss with the best of them? Nothing like my granddaddy Nelson though. Oh my God, granddaddy Nelson could cuss, man. But my granddaddy held on to this, so I'm holding on for you, Pawpaw. So anyway, just a little story there about Tom and Dan, 2 mules and 1 man, my granddaddy. Thank you very much, Jeff Eubanks.